Did you really just do that? I asked, my voice low enough that no one else at the table would hear, even though my hands were already trembling around the stem of my glass. And Daniel didn't even look at me when he laughed, still facing her, still leaning just a little too close, like I was an afterthought in my own marriage. And she smiled at him like she had every right to, like I wasn't even sitting 3 feet away. And when I reached out and touched his arm, just lightly, just enough to remind him I was there, he pulled back, like I was interrupting something important, and muttered, "Relax, Camila, don't start." And the table went quiet for half a second before someone changed the subject. But the damage was already done, because I could feel every pair of eyes pretending not to look at me, pretending not to notice that my husband had just humiliated me in front of his entire office. And I sat there, forcing a small smile, swallowing something sharp and heavy that I refused to name, while he went right back to her like nothing had happened, like I had never said a word. If you've ever felt that kind of silence, the kind that presses down on your chest while everyone else keeps laughing, then you already understand more than I need to explain. And if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a second to like and subscribe, and maybe leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now, because sometimes knowing someone else is listening makes all the difference. My name is Camila Torres. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night I realized my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. The night everything shifted in a way Daniel never saw coming. But to understand how I got to that table, sitting there feeling invisible in my own life, you need to go back to the moment just before it all cracked. The restaurant was one of those upscale places downtown, the kind where the lighting is dim on purpose and the menus don't have prices unless you ask, and Daniel had insisted I come, said it would mean a lot for me to meet his team. So I wore the black dress he once said made me look confident, the one I hadn't touched in months, and I remember standing in front of the mirror before we left, smoothing the fabric over my waist and asking, "Is this okay?" And he glanced up from his phone for half a second and said, "Yeah, that's fine." Already distracted, already somewhere else, and I told myself not to overthink it, not to read into the way he barely looked at me anymore, because marriages go through phases, right? That's what people say. And for the first 20 minutes of dinner, everything seemed normal enough. Polite introductions, small talk, the usual conversations about projects and deadlines and weekend plans, and then she showed up late, slipping into the empty seat next to Daniel, like she belonged there, like it had always been hers. "Sorry, traffic was insane," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and Daniel smiled in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes, and something in my chest tightened just a little, but I ignored it. I told myself I was imagining things, until the jokes started, the inside ones I wasn't part of, the way he leaned closer to hear her over the music, even though she wasn't speaking quietly, the way his hand rested on the back of her chair, then slowly, almost casually, moved to her lower back, and that's when I felt it. Not anger at first, just a cold, sinking clarity, like a piece of a puzzle finally snapping into place. "Daniel," I said softly, trying to keep my tone even, "can I talk to you for a second?" And he sighed like I was inconveniencing him, like I had chosen the worst possible moment to exist. "What is it?" he said, barely turning his head, and I forced a small smile. "Just come here." And when we stepped a few feet away from the table, I kept my voice low, controlled. "What are you doing?" I asked, and he blinked at me like he didn't understand the question. "What does it look like I'm doing?" he said, a hint of irritation creeping in. "You're flirting with her," I said, the words heavier than I expected, and for a second, just a second, I thought maybe he would deny it, maybe he would laugh it off, maybe he would realize how it looked, but instead he shrugged, actually shrugged, like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter. "You're overreacting," he said. "It's just work stuff." And I stared at him, searching his face for something, anything that told me I was wrong, that I had misunderstood, but all I saw was impatience. "Then why does it feel like I don't exist right now?" I asked, quieter this time, and that's when he said it, the sentence that would replay in my head long after that night was over. "If you can't handle it," he said, his voice flat, dismissive, "then maybe you should just walk away." And there it was, simple, careless, like he hadn't just drawn a line between us, like he hadn't just given me an option he never thought I would take, and something inside me went very still, not broken, not shattered, just still, like the moment right before a decision forms. And I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said, and he frowned slightly, like he hadn't expected that response, like he thought there would be more. An argument, tears, something louder, but I didn't give him that. I turned back toward the table, picked up my coat, and as I passed by, I heard someone ask, "Everything okay?" And Daniel answered before I could, "Yeah, she just needed some air." And I smiled politely, the kind of smile that hides everything, and walked out into the cool night air without looking back. But as I reached my car and sat there with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, I realized something that should have been obvious a long time ago. Something about Daniel, about that coworker, about the way his family had always looked at me like I was lucky to be there, like I was the one who should be grateful. And the truth was, none of them had any idea who I actually was, and that night, as I finally let myself think about it, I understood that there was something they had all missed, something I had kept quiet for far too long. And the moment Daniel told me to walk away, he had no idea what he had just set in motion, because what he thought was a simple dismissal was actually the beginning of a truth he wasn't ready to face, and neither was anyone else at that table. I did not start the engine right away. I just sat there in the driver's seat with both hands resting on the wheel, staring at the reflection of my own face in the dark windshield. And for the first time in a long time, I did not try to calm myself down. I did not try to explain his behavior. I just let the silence sit, heavy and honest. And it pulled me somewhere I had not gone in years, back to a small kitchen with chipped white cabinets and a clock that always ticked a little too loud, back to a version of me that learned very early what it meant to be overlooked. I grew up in a house where everything had a place except me. My mother worked double shifts at a diner off Route 17, and my stepfather, Luis, liked things a certain way, his way. And if you did not fit into that, you learned to adjust quickly or stay quiet. Do not make things harder than they already are, my mother used to say while tying her apron, not unkindly, just tired, always tired. And I remember standing at the edge of the kitchen one night when I was maybe 9 years old, holding up a drawing I had made at school, bright colors, uneven lines, something I had spent hours on. "Mom, look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, and she glanced over for half a second before turning back to the stove. "That is nice, Mija, put it on the fridge." And Luis did not even look up from the television, but when his son Mateo walked in a few minutes later with a crumpled report card, Luis muted the television immediately. "Let me see that," he said, leaning forward, his tone sharp but attentive, and I stood there, still holding my paper, waiting for someone to notice that I was still in the room, waiting for something that never came. It was not cruelty, not in the obvious way people talk about. It was quieter than that, smaller, repeated so often it became normal. Mateo got new sneakers when the school year started. I got his old ones cleaned up and relaced. "They are still good," my mother would say, avoiding my eyes, and I would nod because I understood what we could afford and what we could not. But it was never just about money. It was about attention, about who mattered enough to be seen, and somewhere along the way, I learned how to make myself easy to live with, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. By the time I was 14, I had stopped asking for things altogether. I packed my own lunches, did my homework at the corner of the table while everyone else watched television, and when Luis would call out, "Camila, bring me a glass of water," I would get up without thinking, even if Mateo was closer, even if I had just sat down, because that was the role I had been given, and I wore it so well that people forgot it was something that had been placed on me in the first place. There was one night that stayed with me more than the others. I had been accepted into an advanced program at school, something my teacher said could open doors later, and I came home holding the letter like it meant everything. "Mom, I got in," I said, standing in the doorway, and she smiled, genuinely this time. "That is good, mija." But before she could say anything else, Luis cut in from the living room. "What does that cost?" he asked, not looking at me, and my mother hesitated, just long enough for me to understand. "It is just extra classes," I said quickly. "I do not have to go," and she nodded, relief flickering across her face. "Maybe next year," she said, and we never talked about it again. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I did not need it. I told myself a lot of things that made it easier to stay where I was, and that pattern followed me into adulthood in ways I did not even recognize at first, into relationships where I gave more than I asked, where I adjusted instead of confronting, where I chose peace over truth because that was what I had been taught, kept things from falling apart. When I met Daniel, he felt different at the beginning, attentive in a way I was not used to. "You do not have to try so hard with me," he said once, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. And I believed him. I believed that maybe I had finally found a place where I could just be. But over time, the small things started to shift. The way he would interrupt me mid-sentence, the way his opinions slowly became the default, the way I started to hear echoes of my past in his tone without realizing it. "It is not a big deal," he would say whenever something bothered me, and I would nod. Because I had spent years convincing myself that most things were not worth the trouble, that staying quiet was easier than being heard. Sitting in my car that night, replaying the way he had looked at me, the way he had told me to walk away like it was nothing, I realized that the pattern had not just followed me, I had carried it with me, shaped it into something that looked like patience but felt a lot like erasing myself piece by piece. And for the first time, I did not feel small remembering all of that. I felt something else, something steadier, something that did not rush to excuse him or blame myself. And as I finally turned the key in the ignition and the engine came to life, I understood that what happened at that table was not the beginning of the problem. It was just the first time I refused to pretend it was not there. And somewhere between that realization and the drive home, I started to see something I had ignored for far too long. Something about Daniel, about the life we had built, about the things that were never really shared the way I thought they were, and I could feel it, quiet but certain, that there was more to uncover, something I had missed, something he never thought I would question. And by the time I pulled into the driveway, I knew this was not just about what he did that night. It was about everything that led up to it, and everything he had never bothered to ask about me. I did not go inside right away. I stayed in the car for a few extra seconds, listening to the quiet hum of the engine, watching the porch light flicker slightly the way it always did, and for the first time in years, I did not feel like I was coming home. I felt like I was stepping into something I no longer recognized, and that feeling did not come out of nowhere. It had been building slowly, quietly, long before that night at the restaurant, long before Daniel told me to walk away. It started about 3 years into our marriage, around the time everything in my life began to shift in ways I had not expected. I had just taken on a project at work that most people thought I was not ready for, a financial restructuring contract for a small chain of family-owned grocery stores across 3 states. Nothing glamorous, nothing anyone would brag about at a dinner table, but it was complicated, high pressure, and if it worked, it would change everything for the owners involved. I remember sitting at my desk late one evening, spreadsheets open across 2 monitors, the office almost empty, when my manager, Claire, walked by and paused. "You are still here?" she asked, glancing at the clock on the wall. "It is past 9, and I shrugged, not looking up. "Just trying to get ahead of tomorrow." And she stepped closer, scanning the numbers on my screen. "Most people would have pushed this back," she said quietly. "You did not." And I finally looked at her, unsure what to say, and she nodded once, like she had just confirmed something to herself. "Finish this," she said, "and we are going to talk about your role here." And that was the first time anyone had said something like that to me. The first time I felt seen in a way that did not come with conditions or expectations to shrink myself. The project took 6 months, 6 months of early mornings and late nights, of learning systems no one had bothered to explain, of sitting across from owners who had spent decades building something that was now slipping through their hands. And I listened, really listened, because I understood what it meant to feel like everything could fall apart if one piece shifted the wrong way. And when it finally came together, when the numbers stabilized and the stores stayed open, it did not come with applause or recognition, just a quiet email from Claire that read, "Conference room at 10, and when I walked in the next morning, she was already there with 2 other executives I barely knew. "Camila," she said, gesturing for me to sit, "we want to offer you a lead position on a new division." And I blinked, not sure I had heard her correctly. "Lead?" I repeated, and one of the executives leaned forward slightly. "You built something here that we did not expect," he said. "We think you can do it again." and I remember nodding, saying thank you, keeping my voice steady even though something inside me was shifting in a way I could not quite explain. Because this was not just a promotion, it was access to accounts, to decisions, to information that most people never saw, and I took it, quietly, without making a big announcement, without even telling Daniel everything, not because I was hiding it, but because by then I had learned that sharing too much too soon sometimes changed the way people saw you. When I got home that evening, Daniel was sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone. "Hey," I said, setting my bag down. "I got promoted today," and he glanced up for a second. "That is great," he said, already looking back at his screen. "Does that mean more hours?" And I hesitated. Probably, at least for a while, and he nodded like that was the most important part of the conversation. "Just do not burn yourself out," he added, not unkindly, just distracted, and I stood there for a moment, waiting for something more, a question, curiosity, anything, but it did not come, so I moved on, told myself it was enough, that support did not always look the way you expected it to. Over the next year, that role changed everything about my day-to-day life. I was managing accounts that required discretion, handling funds that needed to be moved carefully, strategically, and for the first time, I had something that was entirely mine, something I controlled, and I built it quietly, piece by piece, setting up separate structures, accounts tied to my work, investments that grew slowly but steadily, all of it legal, all of it documented, all of it invisible to anyone who was not looking closely, and no one was, not at home, not in Daniel's world, because in his mind, I was still the same person I had always been, steady, reliable, supportive, someone who would always adjust, always stay. The tension started to show in small ways, comments that seemed harmless on the surface, but carried something underneath, like the night we had dinner with his sister Elena, who had a way of smiling while she measured you. "So you are still doing finance stuff?" she asked, sipping her wine. "That sounds stable." And I smiled back. "It is more than that," I said gently, and she tilted her head. "Like what?" And before I could answer, Daniel cut in. "She handles some accounts, nothing too crazy," he said with a light laugh, and Elena nodded, satisfied. "That is good. Someone has to keep things grounded." And I felt it then, that familiar pull to stay quiet, to let it go, and I almost did. I almost nodded and changed the subject, but something in me paused just for a second longer than usual. "It is actually a bit more complex than that," I said, keeping my tone even, and Daniel glanced at me, surprised, like he had not expected me to push back at all. "Like what?" he repeated, and I met his eyes. "Like managing multi-state restructures and overseeing asset transitions," and the table went quiet for a moment, not dramatic, just enough to shift the air slightly, and Elena blinked. "Oh," she said, setting her glass down. "I did not realize," and I smiled, small and controlled. "Most people do not." And Daniel laughed it off a second later. "She always makes it sound more intense than it is," he said, brushing it aside, and the conversation moved on. But that moment stayed with me, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed, that he did not really know what I did, not because I had hidden it, but because he had never asked, never cared enough to understand, and that realization did not hurt the way it might have before. It settled somewhere deeper, quieter, like a fact I could no longer ignore. By the time I walked into the house that night after the restaurant, keys still in my hand, the memory of that dinner with Elena came back sharper than before, because now it connected to something else, something I had not fully seen, until Daniel told me to walk away. And as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I realized there was a part of my life he had never really been part of, a part he had never questioned, and for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped keeping that part separate, because if he thought he understood what he was risking that night, he was wrong, and I could feel it, clear and certain, that something was about to change in a way none of them were prepared for. I closed the door behind me that night, and the sound felt louder than it should have, like something final, even though nothing had been said yet, and the house was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, like it was waiting for something. And I stood there for a moment, keys still in my hand, replaying his voice in my head, that same flat tone, "If you cannot handle it, walk away." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I could suddenly see how long this had been building, How many small moments I had dismissed as nothing when they were never nothing at all. I walked into the kitchen, set my bag down, and reached for my laptop without thinking. The motion automatic, like I had done it 1,000 times before, and maybe I had, just not for this reason, not with this clarity. And as the screen lit up, I pulled up accounts, files, documents that Daniel had never once asked about. Not because I had hidden them, but because he had never cared enough to notice, and that realization settled in quietly. Not painful anymore, just certain. I did not rush. I did not panic. I moved slowly, deliberately, reviewing everything the way I always did. And somewhere in the middle of that process, my phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with his name, Daniel. And I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. "Hey," I said, my voice steady, and there was a pause on the other end before he spoke. "You left?" he said, like it was an accusation, like I had done something unexpected, and I leaned back against the counter. "You told me to," I replied, and he exhaled sharply. "Come on, Camila, do not twist it like that." And I could picture him running a hand through his hair, pacing somewhere, probably still outside the restaurant, trying to control the situation the way he always did. "It was not a big deal," he added, his tone softer now, rehearsed almost. "You made it awkward." And I closed my eyes for a second, not because I was hurt, but because I recognized the pattern, the shift from dismissal to subtle blame, the way the narrative always adjusted just enough to make me question myself. "I did not make anything awkward," I said quietly. "You embarrassed me." And there was another pause, longer this time, before he laughed lightly, like he was trying to reset the tone. "You are overthinking it," he said. "Everyone was just having a good time." And I looked down at the open files on my screen, numbers and names that told a very different story about control and ownership, about who actually held what in this life we had built. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to defend my feelings. I just listened. "I will be home soon," he continued. "Let us just forget about it, okay?" And that was the moment something shifted again, small but irreversible, because I realized he truly believed this would pass, that I would do what I had always done, absorb it, minimize it, move on, and I found myself nodding even though he could not see me. "Okay," I said, and my voice sounded so calm that even I almost believed it. "We will talk when you get here." And I ended the call before he could say anything else. I set the phone down and went back to the screen, opening folders I had not revisited in months, reviewing ownership structures, account access, the quiet architecture of my financial world that existed parallel to our marriage. And as I moved through each document, each line of data, I started to see something I had overlooked before, not in the numbers themselves, but in the way Daniel had interacted with our shared finances over time, the assumptions he had made, the access he had expected without ever verifying. And then I saw it, a transaction from earlier that week, small enough to go unnoticed at first glance, but out of place in a way that made me pause. And I leaned closer, scrolling through the details, cross-referencing dates, accounts, names, and my chest tightened, not with panic, but with recognition, because this was not a mistake. It was deliberate, subtle, something designed to blend in unless you knew exactly where to look. The front door opened about 20 minutes later, the sound of it breaking the stillness, and I did not move. I stayed exactly where I was, watching the screen as his footsteps approached. "Camila?" he called out, his voice cautious now, testing the air, and I turned slowly, meeting his eyes as he stepped into the kitchen, his jacket still on, his expression a mix of annoyance and something else he had not quite named yet. "You left without saying anything," he said, setting his keys down. And I tilted my head slightly, studying him the way I had started studying everything else. "You told me to walk away," I repeated, and he sighed, already tired of the conversation. "I did not mean it like that," he said. "You know how things get in those environments." And I watched him closely, the way he avoided specifics, the way he leaned on vagueness to smooth over details. "Do I?" I asked quietly, and he frowned, like the question itself was unnecessary. "Yes, you do," he said. "It is just how people interact. You are reading too much into it." And I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable, and then I turned the laptop slightly so the screen faced him. "Then maybe you can explain this to me," I said, my voice still calm. still controlled, and he stepped closer, glancing down at the numbers, at the account name, at the transaction I had just uncovered, and I watched his expression shift, not dramatically, just a flicker, a hesitation that told me everything I needed to know. "What is that?" he asked, too quickly, and I held his gaze. "That is what I was hoping you could tell me," I replied, and for the first time since he walked into the room, he did not have an immediate answer. And the silence that followed was not the kind we had grown used to. It was heavier, sharper, filled with something that neither of us could ignore anymore. Because in that moment, it was no longer just about what happened at the restaurant. It was about something deeper, something hidden, something that had been there long before tonight. And as I watched him struggle to find the right words, I realized that whatever version of our marriage he thought he could return to had just started to fall apart. He did not answer right away. And that was all I needed. Not the words, not an explanation, just that hesitation, that fraction of a second where his confidence slipped and something real showed through, and I watched it happen in slow motion, the way his eyes moved across the screen again, the way his jaw tightened just slightly, like he was recalculating, like he was trying to decide which version of the truth to offer me, and when he finally spoke, his voice was careful, too careful. "It is probably just a routing thing," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the laptop. "You know how these systems work. Things get moved around." And I held his gaze, not interrupting, not helping him fill in the gaps, just waiting. And the silence stretched until it became uncomfortable enough that he shifted his weight. "Camila, you are making this into something it is not," he added, a hint of frustration creeping in, and I nodded slowly, closing the laptop with a soft click. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I am finally looking at something I should have looked at a long time ago." And that was when the tension in the room changed completely, because he could feel it now, that this was not going to dissolve the way it always had, that I was not going to step back and let him reshape the narrative. The next morning started with a message before I even got out of bed, my phone lighting up with his name again. A text this time, "We need to talk." And I stared at it for a moment before setting the phone down without responding. Because for once, I did not feel the urgency to fix things immediately. I did not feel the pull to smooth over the edges of something he had broken, and that alone felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a space I had never allowed myself to occupy before. The calls started an hour later, one after another, each one slightly more insistent than the last, and I let them go to voicemail. Not out of anger, but because I needed the quiet. I needed to hear my own thoughts without his voice shaping them. And when I finally checked the messages, they followed the same pattern I had come to expect. "Hey, call me back," the first one said, casual, almost normal. The second carried a bit more weight. "Camila, do not do this, just call me." And by the third, there was a shift, something sharper underneath. "You are blowing this out of proportion," he said, his voice tight. "We can fix this if you just talk to me." And I listened to each one carefully, not for what he was saying, but for what he was not. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had actually happened, just an urgency to move past it, to regain control of a situation that was slipping further away from him with each unanswered call. By midday, the messages changed again. Longer now, more deliberate, emails this time, subject lines like, "Let us figure this out," and "This is not what you think." And I opened one slowly, reading each line with the same attention I gave to my work. "I know last night was not great," he wrote, "but it was not what you are making it out to be. I would never disrespect you like that, you know that." And I paused there, rereading that sentence, because it was so carefully constructed, so precise in the way it avoided responsibility while still sounding reassuring, and I closed the email without replying. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, and I knew it was him before I even looked. "Camila, open the door," he called, his voice controlled but strained, and I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening, feeling the weight of the decision in something as simple as whether or not to turn the handle. "We need to talk about this face to face," he continued. "You cannot just shut me out." And I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. The idea that my silence was the problem, that my distance was the issue that needed to be addressed, and I stepped closer to the door but did not open it. "I am not shutting you out," I said through the wood, my voice steady. "I am just not fixing this for you." And there was a pause on the other side, a long one, before he spoke again, quieter now. "I am trying here," he said. "Is that not enough?" And I leaned my head back against the wall, closing my eyes for a second, because I could hear the effort in his voice, the frustration, the confusion, but I could also hear what was missing, and that mattered more than anything else. "No," I said simply, and the words settled between us like something final, and he exhaled sharply. "So that is it?" he asked. And I did not answer right away, because I was not sure how to explain something that had taken years to build in a way he would understand in a single conversation. "I do not know what this is yet," I said finally, "but I know it is not what it was." And the silence that followed felt different this time, heavier, more permanent, and after a moment, I heard his footsteps retreat, the faint sound of the front gate closing a few seconds later, and I stayed where I was, listening until there was nothing left to hear. That night, the house felt larger than it ever had before, every room a little too quiet, every corner holding a version of something that no longer fit the way it used to, and I moved through it slowly, turning off lights, closing doors, not out of habit, but out of a need to reclaim the space piece by piece. And when I finally sat down on the couch, phone in my hand, staring at the last message he had sent, "I do not understand what you want from me," I realized that for the first time, I did not feel the need to answer that question for him, because I was still figuring it out for myself, and that space, that distance, that quiet uncertainty settled in around me until it became something else entirely, not loneliness exactly, but a kind of emotional isolation I had never allowed myself to experience before. And as I sat there in that silence, I understood that whatever came next, I would have to face it without the version of him I had spent years trying to protect. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was crying or pacing or doing anything dramatic, but because the quiet would not let me rest. It settled into every corner of the house and stayed there, and every time I closed my eyes, I could hear his voice again, not just from that night, but from all the small moments before it, layered together in a way I had never fully allowed myself to hear. And by morning, I felt something I could not easily name, not anger, not sadness, just a kind of emptiness that made everything feel distant, like I was moving through a version of my life that no longer belonged to me. I went through the motions anyway: coffee, a quick glance at my phone, emails already waiting, deadlines that did not care about personal collapse, and for a few hours, I let myself disappear into work, into numbers and structures that made sense, because they followed rules, because they did not shift depending on someone's mood or need for control, and it helped, just enough to keep me steady, until my phone rang again, this time with a different name on the screen. Elena, and I hesitated before answering, already knowing how this would go. "Camila, what is going on?" she asked the moment I picked up, her voice carrying that familiar mix of concern and quiet judgment. "Daniel says you are not answering him." And I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a second. "That is accurate," I said, and she exhaled softly, like she was trying to stay patient. "He told me you overreacted last night," she continued, "that it was just a misunderstanding." And there it was again, the narrative spreading, reshaping itself before I even had the chance to speak. And I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but because it felt so predictable. "Did he tell you what he said to me?" I asked, and there was a pause on the other end, a small one but enough. "He said things got heated," she replied carefully, "but that you walked out," and I nodded to myself, even though she could not see it. "He told me to walk away," I said, my voice even, and the silence that followed was longer this time, heavier, like she was trying to fit that detail into the version she had already accepted. "I am sure he did not mean it like that," she said finally, softer now, and I let out a quiet breath, not because I was upset, but because I recognized the pattern extending beyond just him. "That is the problem," I replied. "It is always about what he meant, not what he did." And she did not have an answer for that, not right away. "Camila," she said after a moment, "he is trying to fix this," and I looked down at my hands, resting still on the desk. "I know," I said, "but he is trying to fix the outcome, not the cause." And that was when her tone shifted slightly, less understanding now, more defensive. "You are going to lose him if you keep shutting him out like this," she warned. And the words landed in a place that would have shaken me before, but now they felt different, lighter somehow, like they no longer held the same power. Maybe, I said quietly, but I think I already lost something more important, and I ended the call before she could respond. The rest of the day moved slowly, each hour stretching longer than the one before it, and when I finally shut down my laptop that evening, the silence in the house felt heavier than it had the night before. Not new anymore, just settled, like it had decided to stay. And I walked through the rooms without turning on the lights, letting the dim evening glow filter in through the windows, outlining furniture that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. And I realized that for all the time I had spent building this life, this space, I had never really stood in it alone. Not like this, not without the expectation that someone else would fill the gaps, and that realization carried a weight I had not anticipated. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just present, constant, like a low hum I could not turn off. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where I had opened my laptop the night before, and stared at the empty chair across from me, remembering how many conversations had happened there, how many times I had chosen silence over honesty, how many times I had convinced myself that keeping things steady was the same as keeping them right. And I felt it then, not sharply, not all at once, but gradually, a deep sense of loss that had nothing to do with him walking out or me not answering his calls. It was the loss of something I had built inside myself, a version of me that had been shaped around making everything work no matter what, and now that version no longer fit, and I did not know what would take its place. My phone buzzed again on the table. Another message from him, "Please just talk to me." It read, simple, direct, and I stared at it for a long time, longer than I had stared at any of the others, not because I was considering responding, but because I could feel the weight of what it represented, the version of us that still existed for him, the one that could be repaired with the right words, the right timing, the right effort, and I realized that I did not exist in that version anymore, and that realization settled in quietly, final in a way I had not expected. I stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the street, the soft glow of the streetlights stretching across the pavement, everything outside continuing as if nothing had changed. And for a moment, I let myself feel the full weight of where I was, the isolation, the uncertainty, the absence of something I had relied on for years, and I did not try to push it away. I did not try to fill it with distractions or explanations. I just stood there and let it be, because for the first time, I understood that this emptiness was not the end of something. It was the space where something new could begin, even if I did not know what that looked like yet. And as I stepped back from the window, turning toward the quiet house behind me, I felt it, small but undeniable. A shift, not a solution, not clarity, just the first indication that I was no longer standing still. I woke up the next morning before my alarm, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my body had already started adjusting to something new, something quieter, and for the first time in a long time, I did not reach for my phone immediately. I just lay there for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, letting the stillness settle without trying to fill it, and then I got up, walked into the kitchen, and made coffee the same way I always had, measured, steady. But this time I noticed things I had not paid attention to before. The way the light came in through the window at a different angle in the morning, the way the sound of the coffee machine echoed slightly in the empty room, and I realized that the silence no longer felt like something I needed to escape from. It felt like something I could actually use. I opened my laptop and went straight to work, not as a distraction, not as a way to avoid thinking about everything else, but as a choice, intentional, focused. And I pulled up accounts, schedules, projections that had been waiting for decisions I had delayed for too long, and I started moving through them one by one, making calls I had postponed, sending emails I had drafted but never finalized, and within an hour, my calendar looked different, fuller, more aligned with something I had been building quietly in the background for years. Around mid-morning, my phone rang, and this time I answered without hesitation. "Camila," Claire's voice came through, calm but direct. "I saw your updates last night. You moved things faster than expected." And I leaned back slightly, glancing at the numbers on my screen. "I needed to," I replied, and there was a pause, not skeptical, just observant. "Everything all right?" she asked, and I considered the question for a moment, Not in terms of what had happened with Daniel, but in terms of where I was now. Yes, I said finally, just making some adjustments. And she let out a small breath that sounded almost like approval. Good, she said, because I have something I want you to take the lead on. And I felt that familiar shift again. Not overwhelming, just steady. What is it? I asked, and she explained the outline of a new expansion project, something larger than anything I had handled before, multi-state, high stakes, the kind of opportunity that required complete focus. And when she finished, she did not ask if I wanted it. She simply said, "I think you are ready," and I nodded, even though she could not see me. "I am," I replied, and for the first time, I did not second-guess that answer. The days that followed were not dramatic. There were no big declarations, no sudden transformations, just small, consistent decisions. I moved my workspace from the corner of the living room to the dining table, cleared out things that no longer felt necessary, reorganized files, schedules, even the way I approached my time, and each action felt like a quiet reclaiming of something I had slowly given away without realizing it. Daniel's messages did not stop. They shifted, softened, then sharpened again, then softened once more, a cycle I recognized too well. "I miss you." One text read, followed by another an hour later. "Can we please just talk?" And I read them all, not ignoring them, not reacting to them, just acknowledging their presence without letting them dictate mine. And one afternoon, as I was reviewing a set of contracts, my phone rang again, his name lighting up the screen, and I answered, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to hear what he would say now. "Camila," he started, his voice quieter than before. "I have been thinking," and I let him continue without interrupting. "I know I messed up," he said, and I closed my eyes briefly, not because the words affected me, but because I noticed how long it had taken for them to arrive. "I should not have said that," he added, "and I should not have acted like that in front of you." And there was a pause, like he was waiting for something, a response, a signal that he was back on familiar ground, and I kept my voice even. "You are right," I said, and the simplicity of it seemed to catch him off guard. "So, what now?" he asked, and I looked down at the open documents in front of me, at the work I had been building, the structure that existed independently of him. "Now I keep going," I replied, and the silence on the other end was different this time, not confused, not frustrated, just uncertain. And I realized that was something new for him, something he did not know how to navigate. Later that week, I met Claire in person for the first time since everything had shifted. Sitting across from her in a glass-walled conference room, papers spread out between us. "You look different," she said at one point, not critical, just observant, and I tilted my head slightly. "How?" I asked, and she studied me for a second before answering. "More certain," she said, and I considered that not as a compliment, but as a fact. "I think I am," I replied, and she nodded once, like that confirmed what she had already seen in my work. "Good," she said, "because what we are building next is going to require that." And I felt it then, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady understanding, that whatever had shifted in me was not temporary, it was structural, something that would carry forward into everything I did next. That evening, as I drove home, the streets lit by the soft glow of early sunset, I realized I had not thought about that night at the restaurant for several hours, not because it no longer mattered, but because it was no longer the center of everything. It had become one part of a much larger picture. And as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment, not in silence this time, but in something that felt closer to clarity. And for the first time since everything began, I could see it, not fully formed, not completely defined, but present, the outline of something ahead, something I was building without asking for permission, something that did not depend on anyone else's understanding of it. And as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, I knew this was only the beginning of something they had never expected from me. The shift did not happen all at once. It built quietly through consistent days, through decisions that did not look dramatic from the outside, but changed everything underneath. And by the time the new project officially launched, I was no longer adjusting to the role. I was leading it. The first meeting took place in a conference room twice the size of the ones I used to sit in. Glass walls, a long polished table, screens lining one side, and when I walked in, conversations lowered just slightly. not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. And I felt it immediately, not as pressure, but as clarity. This was no longer something I had to prove. It was something I had already built my way into. "Morning, Camila," one of the senior analysts said, as I set my folder down at the head of the table, and I nodded. "Let us get started," I replied, my voice steady, controlled, and as I connected my laptop to the main screen, the data came up exactly where I expected it to, projections aligned, timelines mapped out, every detail accounted for, and when I began walking them through the structure, there were no interruptions, no second guessing, just attention, the kind that comes when people trust what you are saying because you have already shown them you understand what you are doing. "If we adjust the asset allocation here," I said, pointing to a specific section on the screen, "we can stabilize the transition without compromising long-term growth." And one of the executives leaned forward slightly. "You are confident in that?" he asked, not challenging, just confirming. And I met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," I said, "I have run the models 3 different ways," and he nodded once, satisfied. "All right, move forward with it." And the decision was made, clean, efficient, without friction. And for a moment, I paused internally, not because I was unsure, but because I recognized how different this felt from where I had been before, how natural it had become to stand in a space where my voice was not something I had to defend. Later that afternoon, Claire stopped by my office, leaning lightly against the doorframe. "They are already asking about your next phase plan," she said, a small hint of a smile in her tone, and I looked up from my screen. "I will have it ready by Friday," I replied, and she studied me for a second. "You always do," she said, and there was something in that statement that felt less like expectation and more like acknowledgement, and I nodded, turning back to the work in front of me, not because I was avoiding the moment, but because I did not need to hold on to it. I had already internalized what it meant. The changes extended beyond the office, small details that carried weight in ways I had not noticed before. The updated badge clipped to my blazer with my name, and new title printed clearly beneath it, Camila Torres, Lead Director, something I had earned piece by piece without ever announcing it out loud. And the first time I caught my reflection in the elevator mirror wearing it, I did not smile. I did not react at all. I just looked at it for a second longer than usual, acknowledging it as something real, something that belonged to me without explanation. One evening, as I was finishing up at my desk, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "I saw the update on your company site," it read, followed by another, "That is impressive." And I stared at the screen for a moment, not surprised that he had noticed, but aware of the shift in his tone, the way recognition was starting to replace assumption, and I typed back a simple response. "Thank you. Nothing more, nothing less." And his reply came quickly. "I did not realize you were doing all of that," and I set the phone down without answering, not because I wanted to ignore him, but because I did not feel the need to explain something he had never asked about before. A few days later, I ran into Elena at a small gathering, nothing formal, just a casual event tied to one of the projects we had both been loosely connected to, and she approached me with a different kind of energy than before, more measured, more aware. "Camila," she said, her tone softer than I remembered, "I heard about your promotion," and I nodded slightly. "Yes," I replied, and she hesitated for a second, before continuing, "That is a big deal." And I held her gaze, not defensive, not dismissive, just present. "It is," I said, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle something in her expression. "I guess I did not really understand what you were doing before," she admitted, and I tilted my head slightly, considering her words. "Most people did not," I said, and there was no edge to it, no accusation, just a statement of fact, and she nodded, looking down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "Well, I do now," she said, and I could see the shift, subtle but real, and I accepted it without needing to expand on it. That night, as I drove home, the city lights stretching out ahead of me, I found myself thinking back to the moment in the restaurant, the way everything had started to crack from something so simple, so careless, and I realized that the distance between that version of me and who I was now was not measured in time. It was measured in awareness, in the quiet decisions I had made to stop shrinking, to stop adjusting in ways that erased me. And as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment, the same way I had that night, but this time the silence felt different. Not heavy, not uncertain, just still. And as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the door, I understood that the timeline had not just moved forward, it had come full circle. And I was no longer standing in that moment, trying to figure out what it meant. I was standing beyond it, fully aware of what had changed and what had yet to come. I arrived 10 minutes early, which was not unusual for me, but that morning it felt different, intentional, like I needed the extra time to settle into the space before everything shifted again, and the building stood exactly where it always had, glass and steel reflecting a pale gray sky, quiet from the outside, but I knew better than to assume anything about what was happening inside. I stepped through the front doors and the air changed immediately, cooler, controlled, the faint hum of conversations blending with the soft echo of footsteps across polished floors, and I adjusted the strap of my bag slightly as I walked toward the reception desk, where a young assistant looked up and offered a polite smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked, and I returned the smile just enough to be courteous. "I am here for the 9 o'clock meeting," I said, and she typed quickly, scanning the system before nodding. "They are expecting you, conference room 3, down the hall to your left," and I thanked her, turning without hesitation, my steps measured, steady, even though I could feel the tension building just beneath the surface. The hallway was quiet, lined with glass offices, each one holding fragments of conversations I could not fully hear, and as I approached the conference room, I slowed slightly, not out of uncertainty, but because I knew what was waiting on the other side of that door was not just another meeting. It was a moment that connected everything that had happened before. The restaurant, the calls, the silence, the shift, all of it leading here. Through the glass, I could already see them. Daniel sitting at the far end of the table, posture rigid, his hand resting flat against the surface like he needed something solid to anchor himself. And next to him, the same coworker from that night, composed in a way that suggested she believed she understood the situation. And for a brief second, I stood there, just outside the door, watching without being seen, taking in the details, the way Daniel's gaze flicked toward the entrance every few seconds, the way she leaned slightly toward him, whispering something I could not hear, and I realized then that whatever version of the story they had built in the days since, whatever explanation had been shared and accepted, it had not included me. Not really. I opened the door quietly and stepped inside, and the shift in the room was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Chairs adjusted slightly, and Daniel looked up, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing into something more controlled. "Camila," he said, standing halfway before sitting back down, unsure of how to approach the moment, and I nodded once, acknowledging him without adding anything more. "Good morning," I replied, my voice even, and I took a seat across from them, placing my folder on the table with a soft, deliberate motion, and for a few seconds, no one spoke, the silence stretching just enough to make the tension visible, tangible, before the coworker cleared her throat lightly. "We were just going over the preliminary numbers," she said, her tone professional, but there was something underneath it, something that hinted at confidence, built on incomplete information, and I turned my attention to her, meeting her gaze directly. "That is fine," I said. "We can start there," and she nodded, flipping through a set of printed documents. "Based on what we have," she began, "the current structure suggests a minor adjustment, nothing significant." And I listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting her finish, because the details mattered, the assumptions mattered even more, and when she concluded, she looked up, expecting confirmation, expecting agreement, and I gave her a small, polite nod. "That is one way to interpret it," I said, and I saw the flicker of hesitation cross her face, subtle but there. "What do you mean?" she asked, and I leaned back slightly, folding my hands together on the table. "I mean the data you are referencing is incomplete," I replied, and Daniel shifted in his seat, his eyes moving quickly between us. "Incomplete how?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, and I glanced at him briefly before returning my focus to the documents in front of me. "The transaction you are basing your assumptions on," I said, tapping lightly on a specific section, "is only part of the structure," and the room went quiet again, not out of confusion this time, but anticipation, the kind that builds when something is about to be clarified in a way that changes the entire perspective, and the coworker frowned slightly, flipping back through the pages. "This is what we were given," she said, and I nodded. "I know," I replied. "That is the problem." And Daniel leaned forward now, tension visible in the way his shoulders tightened. "Camila," he said, a warning threaded through the calm tone. "What exactly are you saying?" And I met his gaze, steady, unflinching. "I am saying," I began, my voice quiet but precise, "that what you think you are looking at is not the full picture." And the weight of that statement settled over the table, heavy, unavoidable, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because they could all feel it, that something was about to shift in a way none of them had prepared for. And as I reached for the folder in front of me, sliding it open slowly, I knew that whatever came next would change everything they thought they understood. I did not rush. I did not fill the silence. I let it sit there between us as I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, each movement controlled in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and I could feel their attention sharpen, the shift from assumption to uncertainty happening in real time. And when I slid the first document across the table, I did not look at Daniel right away. I looked at her, at the coworker who had been so certain just moments ago. "This is the full structure," I said, my voice even, including the accounts that were not part of your initial review. And she reached for the paper instinctively, scanning the top lines before her expression changed, not dramatically, just enough to signal that something did not align with what she expected. "These accounts are not listed in the primary report," she said, glancing up, and I nodded slightly. "That is because they are not meant to be," I replied, and I could feel Daniel's attention shift fully now, his body leaning forward, tension visible in the way his hands pressed flat against the table. "Camila," he said quieter this time, "what is this?" And I turned to him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "This is the part you did not account for," I said, and I let that settle before continuing, "the part that actually controls the structure you have been working with." And the room went still again, not in confusion, but in realization, slow, unfolding, and I watched it happen, the way both of them started to piece things together, not fully yet, but enough to understand that the ground they were standing on was not as stable as they had believed. The coworker flipped to the next page, her movements more careful now, more precise. "These signatures," she began, trailing off as she looked closer, and I finished the thought for her. "Are mine," I said, and the words landed softly, without force, but with a clarity that made them impossible to dismiss. And Daniel's reaction was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just a sharp intake of breath, a pause that spoke louder than anything he could have said in that moment. "You, what?" he asked, and I held his gaze steady. "I built this," I said, "not overnight, not recently, over time," and I gestured lightly to the documents. "Every account, every transition, every adjustment you have been working with has been structured through systems I put in place." And the coworker looked between us now, her confidence replaced with something more cautious. "You are saying you control this entire framework?" she asked, and I nodded once. "I am saying I oversee it," I replied, and I could see the shift in her posture, the recalibration happening, as she processed what that meant, not just for the project, but for her understanding of who I was in this room. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief. "Why would you not tell me this?" he asked, and there was something almost genuine in the question, like he was trying to understand a gap he had never noticed before, and I considered it for a moment before answering. "You never asked," I said simply, and the weight of that response settled over him in a way that was harder to deflect than any accusation could have been, because it was true, not exaggerated, not emotional, just factual. And he looked down briefly, his jaw tightening before he spoke again. "That does not make sense," he said, quieter now, like he was trying to regain footing. "We share everything." And I tilted my head slightly, not dismissive, just observant. "Do we?" I asked, and the question hung there. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but precise enough to expose everything it needed to. The coworker closed the folder slowly, her movements deliberate, and when she looked at me again, her expression had changed completely. Not defensive, not dismissive, just aware, We need to reassess the entire projection, she said, turning slightly toward Daniel, but her tone carried a different kind of respect now, one that had not been there before. And I nodded once. Yes, I said, you do. And Daniel let out a breath he had been holding, his eyes moving between the documents and me, and for a moment I saw it clearly, the exact second when his understanding shifted, when the version of me he had carried for years no longer fit with the reality in front of him. And it was not loud, not dramatic. It was quiet, internal, but unmistakable. And he shook his head slightly, more to himself than to anyone else. I did not know, he said, almost under his breath. And I watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity. No, I replied, you did not. And the simplicity of it left no room for anything else. The room stayed silent for a few seconds longer, not out of uncertainty anymore, but because there was nothing left to say that would return things to what they had been before. And I could feel it. That shift, not just in how they saw me, but in how the entire situation had been reframed. And as I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on the table, I realized that this moment was not about proving anything. It was about revealing something that had always been there, something they had chosen not to see. And now that they had, there was no way to go back. And as Daniel sat there, still processing, still trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what had just been placed in front of him, I saw it clearly in his expression. Not anger, not even regret, but something deeper, a realization that came too late to change what had already been set in motion. And in that quiet, controlled moment, everything he thought he understood about me, about us, about his place in this structure, collapsed without a single raised voice. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that could have been said had already shifted into something else, something heavier, something that required more than quick reactions or easy explanations. And I could see it in the way Daniel sat there, his posture no longer controlled, no longer certain, his hands no longer steady on the table, and for the first time since I had known him, he did not look like someone who understood the room he was in. The coworker was the first to move. We will need to revise everything, she said, her tone careful, respectful in a way it had not been before, and I nodded once. Yes, I replied, you will. And she hesitated for a moment, then added, I will coordinate with you directly. And there was no confusion in her voice now, no assumption, just acknowledgement, and I accepted it without comment, because it was not something I needed to reinforce. It was already understood. Daniel stood a moment later, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and for a second, it seemed like he might say something immediate, something to regain ground. But instead he paused, looking at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time, not as the version he had grown comfortable with, but as someone entirely separate from that narrative. Camila, he said, his voice lower than before. Can we talk? And I held his gaze, steady, not avoiding, not softening, just present. We are talking, I replied, and he exhaled, frustration flickering briefly across his expression before settling into something quieter. Not like this, he said, glancing around the room, and I followed his gaze for a second, taking in the space, the table, the documents, the context he had once felt in control of, and I shook my head slightly. This is exactly where it needs to happen, I said, and the finality in my tone left no room for negotiation. Later that afternoon, the ripple effect had already started, messages coming in from different directions, some direct, some indirect, all carrying the same underlying shift. And when my phone rang with Elena's name again, I answered without hesitation this time. Camila, she said, her voice tighter than before, less certain. I just spoke to Daniel, and I leaned back in my chair, letting her continue. He told me what happened, she added, and there was a pause, like she was choosing her words more carefully now. I did not realize, she trailed off, and I waited, not filling the silence for her. And she tried again. I did not realize you were involved at that level, and I could hear it clearly, the recalibration, the way her understanding was shifting to accommodate something she had never considered before. I have always been involved, I said calmly. You just never asked. And she let out a quiet breath, not defensive this time, just processing. I think we all made assumptions, she admitted, and I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. Yes, I replied, you did. And there was no edge in my voice, no need for it, because the truth itself was enough. Daniel called again later, not once, but 3 times in a row, and this time I answered on the third, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to hear what he would say now that everything had shifted. "I did not know," he said immediately, skipping any pretense, and I leaned against the counter, listening. "I should have known," he added, his voice carrying something I had not heard before, not just regret, but recognition, and I let the silence stretch for a second before responding. "You could have," I said, "but you chose not to." And he exhaled slowly, like the weight of that landed differently now. "That is not fair," he said, not defensive, just struggling. And I considered that, not dismissing it, but not accepting it either. "It is accurate," I replied, and there was another pause, longer this time, before he spoke again. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. And the question hung there, heavy in its simplicity, because for the first time, he was not telling me what the situation was. He was asking, and I realized how unfamiliar that was between us, "I want you to understand something," I said, my voice steady. "This is not about fixing what happened that night." And he did not interrupt, he just listened. "This is about everything that came before it," I continued. "The assumptions, the way you spoke to me, the way you decided who I was, without ever actually asking." And I could hear him breathing on the other end, quiet, attentive. "I cannot undo that for you," I added. "And I'm not going to carry it for you anymore." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been unspoken for years. And when he finally responded, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "I understand," he said, and I believed that he thought he did, but I also knew that understanding something and changing because of it were not the same thing. That evening, I stood in the kitchen again, the same place where everything had started to unravel, but it felt different now. Not because everything was resolved, but because it was not. Because there were still pieces that had not settled, conversations that had not fully played out. And as I looked around the room, I realized that clarity did not come with closure, not immediately. Sometimes it just came with awareness, with the quiet knowledge that things had changed in a way that could not be reversed. And as I turned off the light and moved toward the hallway, I felt it again. That space, that unfinished edge. Not painful, not overwhelming, just present, like a question that had not been fully answered yet. The house feels different now, not because anything inside it has changed physically, but because I have, and that shift shows up in small, quiet ways that no one else would notice, like how I move through the rooms without hesitation, how I no longer pause before speaking, how the silence no longer feels like something I need to fill, but something I can stand in without losing myself. The days have settled into a rhythm that belongs entirely to me. Mornings that start with clarity instead of uncertainty, work that challenges me without diminishing me, and evenings that feel like a return to something steady rather than something I have to manage or repair. And it is not perfect. Not everything is resolved or tied neatly together, but it is honest, and that has become more important than anything else. Daniel and I are no longer navigating the same space, not in the way we used to, and that truth did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, through conversations that were no longer about fixing, but about understanding, through moments where we both had to acknowledge what could not be undone and what would not continue the way it had before. And one afternoon, standing in the doorway as he gathered the last of his things, he looked at me with a kind of quiet clarity I had not seen in him before. "I did not see you," he said, not as an excuse, but as a realization, and I nodded, because there was nothing else to say to that, no need to soften it or reshape it into something easier. "I know," I replied, and that was enough, because sometimes the truth does not need to be expanded, it just needs to be recognized. I have learned that boundaries are not loud, they are not dramatic declarations or sudden exits. They are quiet decisions that you make consistently, even when no one else understands them, even when they are inconvenient or uncomfortable, and the most important ones are often the ones no one else can see. The ones that protect your time, your energy, your sense of self. And for a long time, I thought love meant adjusting, accommodating, making space for someone else at the cost of myself. But now I understand that real love does not require you to disappear in order to exist. It does not ask you to shrink so that someone else can feel larger. And it certainly does not survive on silence that hides what needs to be spoken. If you are listening to this and you recognize something in it, something that feels familiar in a way that is hard to explain, I want you to know that your awareness is not something to ignore. That quiet voice that tells you when something is not right is not weakness. It is guidance. It is your intuition, your connection to something deeper, something that does not need proof or permission to be valid, and whether you believe in God or the universe, or simply the strength of your own inner knowing, that voice exists to protect you, not to be dismissed. I have also learned that independence is not just about standing on your own financially, although that matters more than most people are willing to admit. It is about understanding your value without needing it to be confirmed by someone else. It is about making decisions that align with who you are becoming, not who you were told to be. And that takes time, it takes patience, it takes a willingness to sit in discomfort without rushing back to what feels familiar but no longer serves you. There were moments when I wanted to go back, not because it was right, but because it was known. And there is a difference between the two that we often ignore until we are forced to see it clearly. And in those moments, I had to remind myself that growth does not always feel like progress. Sometimes it feels like loss, like letting go of something you spent years building, but what you are actually releasing is not the foundation. It is the version of yourself that was built to survive in a space that no longer fits. I am not the same person I was that night in the restaurant, not because of what happened, but because of what I chose to do after it, the way I listened to myself, the way I stopped explaining things that did not need justification, the way I allowed the truth to stand on its own without trying to make it easier for someone else to accept. And that is something no one can take from me, because it was not given, it was claimed. So if you are in a place where you feel overlooked, misunderstood, or quietly diminished, I hope you give yourself permission to pause, to look at your life without the filters you have been taught to use, and to ask yourself one simple question, not what can I fix, not what can I tolerate, but what do I deserve, and then listen carefully to the answer, because it will tell you more than anyone else ever could. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening in a way that feels less like watching and more like understanding. Because in sharing this, I am reminded that none of us are as alone as we think we are, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply recognize ourselves in someone else's truth. My name is Camila Torres. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is this. You do not lose yourself all at once, but you can choose to find yourself in a single moment of clarity, and that moment is always yours to take. And if something in this story stayed with you, if it echoed in a way that feels personal, I invite you to share where you are in your journey, to connect, to continue these conversations, because there are more stories like this, more moments of quiet realization and strength waiting ahead, and if you are ready, I will be here to walk through them with you, one story at a time, just like this one.